The galaxy runs on a simple principle that sophisticated species call resource optimization, and less diplomatic observers might call organized theft. The Collective, a federation of 17 spacefaring civilizations with impeccable manners and flexible ethics, had perfected the art of planetary harvesting over 12,000 years. They didn't consider it conquest. They considered it inventory management. Their approach combined scientific methodology with the moral compass of a corporate tax attorney, methodical, legal by their own carefully written standards, and utterly unconcerned with how it looked to the natives. When they discovered Earth, their assessment was brief and dismissive. Pre-unified carbon-based bipeds with nuclear capabilities and reality television. Technological potential, moderate. Military threat, negligible. Cultural contribution, to be determined, but preliminary scans detect an unusual number of cat videos. The Collective's harvest protocol was standard. Strip a planet of 95% of its resources, population, and infrastructure, while preserving one small region as a control group. A scientific baseline to study how the species might have developed if left alone. It wasn't compassion, it was record-keeping. The selection of the control region was supposed to be random, run through quantum algorithms to prevent bias. So when New Zealand was chosen, conspiracy theorists immediately suspected the influence of certain fantasy films shot there decades earlier. The Collective denied this vehemently, though Administrator Vexilor was later caught with a complete collector's edition and several questionable cosplay items in his personal quarters. The barrier went up on a Tuesday. Most New Zealanders were eating breakfast when an iridescent dome materialized over their entire country, cutting through the ocean floor and extending into low orbit. Communications went dead. Aircraft bounced off it like bugs on a windshield. The rest of humanity had approximately 8 hours to panic before the harvesting ships arrived. Massive geometric structures that looked like someone had weaponized modern architecture. The harvesting was methodical in the way only beings who've had 12 millennia to refine their logistics can be. Cities were cataloged, then dismantled. Natural resources were extracted with the precision of a surgeon who bills by the hour. Cultural artifacts were collected, labeled, and stored in massive archive ships. Humans were processed according to usefulness. Those with valuable skills were relocated to collective labor colonies. The rest were placed in preservation stasis for later study or deployment. Human resistance was immediate, fierce, and about as effective as throwing rocks at a tsunami. Military responses were neutralized with technology that made nuclear weapons look like angry hand gestures. The internet briefly unified in a way previously thought impossible. Russians and Americans coordinating attacks, North Koreans and South Koreans sharing intelligence, social media influencers and basement hackers forming unlikely alliances. Before the Collective simply shut it down like closing a noisy app. Inside the New Zealand barrier, Prime Minister Aroha Ngata stood on the steps of Parliament, watching the iridescent wall that now defined her nation's borders. She was a former economics professor who had run on a platform of pragmatic progressivism and now found herself leading the last intact human government on Earth. "Well," she said to her trembling cabinet, "I suppose this puts our trade negotiations with Australia in perspective." The barrier was transparent enough to see the harvesting ships hovering over Sydney, transparent enough to watch as the Opera House was carefully extracted whole and lifted into orbit, transparent enough to see the methodical dismantling of civilization while being completely unable to help. New Zealand's military, all 27 operational aircraft and 9 naval vessels, had already tested the barrier and confirmed what was obvious. They were in a snow globe, watching the world being erased. 5 years passed. Inside the barrier, New Zealand transformed. Without global supply chains, they had been forced to become entirely self-sufficient. Without allies, they had become unified in a way democracies rarely achieve. Without external threats, beyond the existential one visible through their iridescent ceiling, they had redirected their defense resources into research and development. Prime Minister Ngata had been re-elected unanimously, which would have concerned her democratic principles if the circumstances weren't so extraordinary. Her office in the Beehive, New Zealand's executive wing of Parliament, had become a war room, though the nature of the war remained unclear to most citizens. The walls were covered with screens monitoring the harvesting operations visible beyond the barrier. The collective had been methodical, working their way across continents like a meticulous librarian reshelving books. They've reached the last major population center in North America, reported Dr. Tama Walsh, head of the newly formed Xenological Research Division. Once a marine biologist specializing in cephalopod communication, he now led humanity's efforts to understand their cosmic jailers. Toronto is being processed. The resistance cells in the Canadian Rockies are still active, but they'll be found, Ngata finished. She didn't need to watch the screens anymore. The pattern had been established years ago. Human resistance was clever, determined, and ultimately futile. What's our status on Project TUI? Ready for final testing, Walsh replied, referring to their most ambitious initiative. Named after a native bird known for its ability to mimic sounds, including now alien communication patterns. The question is whether we'll have an opportunity to deploy it before they finish with Earth and remember we exist. That opportunity arrived sooner than expected. 3 days later, a collective diplomatic vessel requested permission to enter the barrier, a courtesy that felt like being asked if they'd prefer to be slapped with the left hand or the right. Administrator Vexlor, the overseer of Earth's harvesting operation, wished to conduct an inspection of the preservation zone. Vexlor resembled a tall, elegant mantis with too many joints and a face that suggested he was perpetually smelling something unpleasant. His carapace gleamed with embedded technology, and his 4 primary eyes swiveled independently, making it impossible to tell what he was looking at, a trait that made him an excellent bureaucrat and a terrible dinner companion. Prime Minister Ngata, he chittered through his translation device, your preservation zone has been most successful. Our monitors indicate your population has actually increased by 4.3% since isolation, and your technological development, while limited by resource constraints, has proceeded along expected trajectories. We're resilient, Ngata replied with a diplomatic smile that didn't reach her eyes, though we remain curious about the purpose of our preservation. Scientific baseline, Vexlor explained with the patience of someone who has rehearsed the same justification many times. Every harvested world maintains one control region to observe how development might have continued without collective intervention. It provides valuable comparative data. How thoughtful, Ngata said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. And the rest of humanity? Efficiently allocated, Vexlor replied, his mandibles clicking in what might have been pride. Earth's resources have been 87% extracted, and human specimens have been distributed to appropriate facilities. The harvesting will be complete within 6 standard months. I see. Ngata maintained her composure, though her knuckles whitened around her ceremonial greeting staff. And then we monitor your preservation zone for another century or so, collecting data on your development. The collective is nothing if not thorough in its research methodologies. The meeting concluded with the formal presentation of a proposal. The collective was seeking local assistance with the final phases of harvesting. Certain human resistance groups had proven surprisingly elusive, hiding in remote regions and using primitive methods that confounded advanced scanning. New Zealanders, being human themselves, might be more effective at locating these holdouts. In exchange, Vexlor offered, your preservation zone would receive certain privileges, expanded territory perhaps, or access to specific technologies deemed appropriate for your development level. Ngata promised to consider the offer, and Vexlor departed, apparently satisfied that he had made a reasonable business proposition rather than ask the last free humans to betray their species. 3 days later, global communication systems that had been silent for 5 years suddenly activated. Every functioning screen, speaker, and neural interface across the harvested Earth received the same broadcast. Prime Minister Aroha Ngata, standing before New Zealand's Parliament, announcing their decision. After careful consideration of our position and the realities we face, New Zealand has agreed to assist the collective in completing their harvesting operation, she stated, her voice firm and clear. We will provide intelligence on remaining human resistance groups and assist in their location. In exchange, we have secured guarantees for our continued autonomy and access to certain technologies that will benefit our preservation. The broadcast continued with details of the arrangement, but the damage was done in those first sentences. Across labor camps and resistance hideouts, the message was the same. The last free humans had chosen to collaborate. The betrayal was absolute. In a hidden bunker beneath the Canadian Rockies, resistance leader Elena Volkov smashed a monitor with her rifle butt. "Cowards," she spat. "They sit safe behind their barrier while we fight and die, and now they sell us out?" Her second-in-command, Marcus Chen, was more contemplative. "It doesn't make sense. Ngata was known for her principles before all this. Why would she collaborate now, when the harvesting is almost complete?" "Principles are luxury items," Volkov replied bitterly. "They've been safe for 5 years while we've lost everything. Maybe they've forgotten they're human." 2 weeks later, the first New Zealand advisory teams emerged from the barrier under collective escort. They wore distinctive blue uniforms and carried detection equipment supposedly designed to locate human biosignatures. They began in Australia, methodically sweeping areas where resistance had been reported. Strangely, their sweeps consistently found nothing, despite collective intelligence suggesting otherwise. Administrator Vexlor became increasingly suspicious as team after team returned with negative results or arrived at locations just after resistance groups had mysteriously relocated. Meanwhile, Tama Walsh was no longer in his laboratory. He was swimming through the cold waters of Fovo Strait, following a path that had been mapped with painstaking precision. The barrier extended deep into the ocean floor, but years of subtle testing had revealed something the collective didn't know. It had a flaw, a quantum fluctuation that occurred at precise intervals, creating a momentary passage barely wide enough for one person. Walsh's specialized wetsuit protected him from the cold, but couldn't do much about his terror as he approached the barrier's underwater edge. The timing had to be perfect, too early or too late, and he would slam into impenetrable energy or be detected by perimeter sensors. He counted down in his head, matching the rhythm they had calculated over thousands of observations, and then pushed forward at the exact moment the fluctuation occurred. For a sickening second, he felt resistance, as if swimming through gelatin. Then he was through, outside the barrier for the first time in 5 years. A small submersible was waiting exactly where it was supposed to be, crewed by resistance members who had received coded instructions hidden in the broadcast that had appeared to announce New Zealand's betrayal. "Did you bring it?" asked the submersible pilot, a woman with the hardened look of someone who had been fighting too long. Walsh patted the waterproof case strapped to his chest. "Enough to start. More will come through the same way I did." "I still don't understand why your people pretended to betray us," the pilot said as they descended to avoid collective patrols. "Because," Walsh explained, "sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight, and sometimes the best way to move freely is to be invited by your enemy."